Much for coming back. And we now have the last session, as you know. We are going to listen to two more papers, and after that, there will be a general discussion of all the papers that have been given this morning. Now, our next speaker will be Gerasimus Pankratis from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, who is going to speak about the islands the Ionian Islands, Corfu and the others, of course. And please, your turn.
Ma prima di tutto vorrei ringraziare l'Istituto Veneto, persona il professor Ortali, per l'invito e per la cordiale ospitalità. Mi permettete prima di leggere la mia relazione di portare i saluti del professor Nikos Moskonas, di cui leggerò un piccolo testo breve, abbastanza breve. Il Centro di Studi Ioni ha aderito con entusiasmo alla proposta dell'Istituto Veneto di rintracciare e studiare le tariffe mercantili possibilmente esistenti negli archivi greci e particolarmente in quelli delle isole Ionie. Una idea molto affascinante, la quale però non è stata sostenuta dal materiale esistente nei fondi archivistici greci. Negli archivi greci e massimamente in quelli delle isole Ionie si incontrano materiali di questo tipo o affine, ma riguardanti periodi posteriori a quello in esame, particolarmente dal Settecento in poi. I materiali che potrebbe riguardare i domini veneziani d'oltremare si dovrebbe forse ricercare negli archivi veneziani stessi, una ricerca che richiede maggior disponibilità sia di tempo che di fondi. Seguono i saluti del professor Mosconas del Consiglio amministrativo per il buon procedimento dei lavori del convegno, che ormai è quasi alla sua fine. E adesso inizia la mia relazione. Lo scopo di questa comunicazione non è quello di illustrare le fonti relative alla marina mercantile delle isole Ionie nel periodo della dominazione veneziana. Questo lavoro è già stato fatto nelle linee generali da Frederick Lane e altri storici che parteciparono ai colloqui d'histoire maritime che si svolsero negli anni 50 e 60. 10 anni fa io ho invece proposto un adattamento delle categorie stabilite in quella sede alle peculiarità del caso greco, adattamento che fissava 9 gruppi principali di fonti che potete vedere nella trasparenza. Dopo essermi a lungo occupato dello studio e dell'elaborazione di gran parte di questo materiale di archivio, per una ricerca riguardante la storia dell'imprenditoria commerciale marittima gestita da greci sudditi di Venezia nel XVI secolo, cercherò ora, focalizzando i presupposti relativi allo spazio geografico trattato e alle persone operanti nel commercio marittimo, da un lato di analizzare le principali questioni metodologiche riguardanti le in cui veniva esercitato il commercio e conseguentemente di valutare il materiale di archivio in esame e dall'altro di stabilire un approccio critico a quelle fonti di archivio che sono di importanza primaria per la nostra ricerca. La comprensione dello stato di sudditanza in cui si trovavano i greci e delle soluzioni alternative che potevano adottare per superare le difficoltà derivanti proprio da questa loro condizione, costituisce la premessa necessaria per poter rintracciare nelle fonti questi sudditi greci e per individuare i loro margini di azione. Credo che sia generalmente accettato che, nonostante le periodiche adozioni di nuovi obiettivi, la visione dei veneziani riguardo all'amministrazione dei loro territori nel Levante ebbe un carattere fortemente coloniale fino alla fine. I possedimenti veneziani avevano l'obbligo di sostenere gli interessi del loro centro amministrativo e dei suoi esponenti in modo da poter realizzare una serie di obiettivi, come assicurare la posizione privilegiata dei mercanti veneziani, tutelare le imprese marittime o manifatturiere di questi ultimi, mantenere il ruolo centrale del mercato veneziano e garantire l'autosufficienza alimentare nei possedimenti nella metropoli. Operando in questo ambito, i sudditi greci del Doge avevano precisi vincoli e diritti che a livello pratico comportavano il pagamento di una tassazione diversa rispetto ai veneziani, la loro esclusione dal trasporto di alcune mercanzie, il trasporto di alcune altre a determinate condizioni, eccetera. Ma la posizione dei sudditi nel commercio marittimo di Venezia è stata sempre la stessa? In altre parole, lo stato di sudditanza era una condizione fissa, senza prospettive di cambiamenti che avrebbero potuto condurre, ad esempio, al progresso economico e sociale dei sudditi stessi? Le difficoltà affrontate nella gestione del commercio già dai tempi delle guerre d'Italia, difficoltà congiunturali ma anche strutturali, costrinsero la Serenissima a concedere deroghe ai divieti permanenti che accompagnavano l'esercizio del commercio da parte dei suoi sudditi o alla tassazione sul trasporto di quei prodotti necessari al mercato di rialto, eccetera. Alcune di queste deroghe venivano rinnovate così frequentemente da diventare quasi la regola. In tali eccezioni vanno rintracciate anche alcune tendenze verso importanti cambiamenti nella posizione delle popolazioni assoggettate. Da un certo momento in poi i sudditi, insieme agli stranieri, diventarono indispensabili perfino per le attività che in altri tempi erano state appannaggio esclusivo dei patrizi veneti. Casi come la gestione da parte di sudditi dell'Eptaneso del commercio veneziano con i porti britannici alla fine del XVI secolo o l'affermarsi di greci all'inizio del XVII secolo ai vertici di organi collettivi veneziani, come ad esempio i capi dei parcenevoli che rappresentavano gli interessi della proprietà marittima, evidenziano il superamento dei limiti imposti e la progressiva ascesa di alcuni sudditi. Parallelamente confermano il collaudato schema di rivendicazione da parte di imprenditori marittimi sudditi o stranieri di uno spazio sempre più ampio di quello che i veneziani andavano progressivamente abbandonando, dal momento che ormai l'esercizio diretto della navigazione mercantile aveva cominciato a perdere importanza per loro. I commercianti marittimi greci ebbero per i veneziani la funzione di strumenti utili per i mercati del Mediterraneo orientale, dove commerciavano in prodotti necessari al mercato veneziano. Ed è proprio qui che si concentrano i vari margini entro cui i sudditi greci potevano cercare vie alternative per esercitare le loro attività in condizioni più favorevoli di quelle riservate a persone in stato di sudditanza. Questo tipo di commercio riguardava principalmente i territori ottomani, geograficamente molto estesi, che distavano solo poche ore dall'Eptaneso e funzionavano quasi da entroterra delle 7 isole, con le quali costituivano una unica entità economica. In quell'area gli abitanti dell'Eptaneso avevano la possibilità di esercitare il commercio in qualità di sudditi veneziani. Erano di conseguenza sottoposti a una tassazione diversa rispetto a quella dei mercanti locali. Disponevano però anche di scelte alternative: collaborare con connazionali, sudditi del sultano, sfruttando i vantaggi di cui questi ultimi godevano in quanto nativi del luogo, oppure operare in prima persona come sudditi ottomani, trasferendo ad esempio le sedi delle loro attività imprenditoriali o le loro famiglie in territori ottomani. Nei decreti del Senato veneziano, a partire dalla fine del XV secolo in poi, troviamo riflesso il costante sforzo delle autorità veneziane di limitare molte di tali collaborazioni e controllare a proprio vantaggio la grande facilità di movimento dei loro sudditi, elemento d'altronde di per sé insito nella natura stessa dell'imprenditoria marittima. In fonti di tipo privato però si registrano parallelamente una grande quantità di contatti e scambi che i sudditi della Serenissima mantenevano con uomini chiave della zona, cristiani, musulmani ed ebrei. Il noleggio di navi da parte di sudditi della Repubblica a mercanti ottomani per il commercio estero, ma anche per il commercio e il trasporto all'interno dell'impero ottomano, il finanziamento delle loro imprese di navigazione da parte di ottomani, la rappresentanza ufficiale di gruppi di mercanti e marittimi, sia cristiani che musulmani, esercitata da abitanti dell'Eptaneso nei possedimenti veneziani, la comproprietà di navi detenuta dai sudditi della Serenissima e sudditi della Sublime Porta, eccetera. Man mano che gli ottomani dall'inizio del XVI secolo in poi avanzano, conquistando territori fino ad allora appartenuti a Venezia, comincia ad acquisire caratteristiche ben chiare un gruppo di sudditi greci della Serenissima, tra virgolette, senza patria. Si tratta di persone provenienti principalmente dalla Morea, ma anche da Cipro, che dopo la conquista ottomana continuarono a occuparsi del commercio fra Venezia e le loro ex patrie, servendosi di reti formati dai loro parenti o da antichi collaboratori che continuavano a vivere in quelle regioni. Con metodi di questo tipo, lo status del suddito veneziano o ottomano poteva acquistare una flessibilità che lo trasformava da ostacolo per l'accesso alle fonti delle mercanzie in lasciapassare per una mobilità ancora maggiore. L'esperienza e le conoscenze che i greci possedevano sul commercio con il Levante e in particolare sulle persone che operavano in tutte le fasi della produzione, del trasporto e della tassazione di prodotti, come pure sui porti di carico e di scarico, li resero eccezionalmente utili ai veneziani. Come si deduce dai dati che ho riferito, le collaborazioni fra abitanti dell'Eptaneso e ottomani, sia greci che no, furono favorite dalle caratteristiche dello spazio geografico stesso. Le isole del Mar Ionio, grazie alla loro posizione geostrategica e alla particolare funzione che Venezia aveva loro assegnato, furono base ma anche tappa intermedia per imprenditori della navigazione provenienti in gran parte dal Mediterraneo orientale e in misura minore anche occidentale. Nell'Eptaneso avevano inviato i loro consoli potenze occidentali, ma anche comunità ottomane che mantenevano stabili rapporti mercantili con Venezia e i suoi possedimenti. Di tutte queste funzioni troviamo tracce nella documentazione archivistica in cui si riflettono attività economiche con un raggio di azione ben più esteso di quello riguardante il commercio locale. Veniamo ora a una valutazione critica del genere e della qualità delle fonti di archivio su cui si basa la nostra ricerca riguardante le attività marittime e mercantili dei greci sudditi di Venezia. Per il periodo che stiamo trattando, le fonti, diciamo così, facili, cioè i cataloghi comprendenti gli equipaggi, carichi, porti di carico e scarico, eccetera, come quelle offerte ad esempio dagli uffici di sanità e del fisco, sono evidentemente pochissime. Hanno a che fare d'altronde tanto con precise funzioni dello Stato, tassazione, arruolamento, armamento di navi, quanto con gli obiettivi dei sudditi e riguardano determinati momenti e congiunture storiche. Le poche fonti individuate che forniscono dati quantitativi concorrono comunque a confermare l'importanza di questa ricerca in corso. Costituiscono inoltre preziosi punti di riferimento e solide basi di raffronto e conferma di altri dati riguardanti l'imprenditorialità marittima e mercantile. Il problema di queste fonti, oltre al numero limitato, è anche la loro frammentarietà. Somigliano quasi a una istantanea che riproduce un determinato momento. In altre parole, non costituiscono una sezione di più ampie raccolte di archivio in grado di fornirci dati elaborabili, ordinati in serie cronologiche prive di lacune. E questa circostanza ci costringe a servirci necessariamente di fonti di tipo differente. Attraverso un approccio critico al materiale di archivio, per quanto riguarda la qualità delle informazioni che potrebbero soddisfare più efficacemente l'obiettivo che ci siamo prefissi, siamo pervenuti ad alcune prime riflessioni. Siamo soliti parlare di capitani di navi greci e del loro progressivo affermarsi, riferendoci ai greci di Venezia, in particolare a un limitato numero di individui che ebbero un qualche ruolo nella storia della confraternita di San Niccolò a Venezia. Uno dei vantaggi derivanti dallo studio degli archivi prodotti dalla confraternita, cioè dall'organo collettivo di rappresentanza dei greci a Venezia, è l'eliminazione delle distinzioni fra sudditi della Serenissima e della Sublime Porta, dal momento che il criterio per la partecipazione alla vita della confraternita era l'essere greci, con tutto quello che tale termine significava nel XVI secolo, e non invece la loro sudditanza ai veneziani o agli ottomani. L'iscrizione alla confraternita non comportava però che le persone iscritte risiedessero stabilmente nella città, né che costituissero il totale degli imprenditori marittimi greci operanti a Venezia. E questo perché esisteva un limite massimo di iscrizioni all'anno, che non sembra peraltro sia stato mai raggiunto. Nello stesso momento decine di greci, sudditi dell'impero ottomano o della Serenissima, erano attivi nel mercato di Rialto. Noleggiavano le loro navi a veneziani o a dalmati, costituivano società con altri sudditi veneziani e nominavano i loro rappresentanti italiani nel porto di Venezia. La maggior parte di questi individui erano sconosciuti alla confraternita greca. Non appaiono però sconosciuti fonti di carattere privato che rispecchiano il funzionamento del mercato. I diversi obiettivi e le modalità con cui venivano redatte le fonti di questa categoria mettono in luce la varietà di dati che esse potrebbero offrire allo studio della imprenditoria marittima in confronto agli archivi del governo centrale per scopi essenzialmente normativi. Per il periodo in esame, nel materiale di archivio a nostra disposizione, le maggiori tracce dell'attività mercantile sulle rotte marine sono rintracciabili nei registri dei notai. Attraverso gli atti notarili è possibile esaminare le imprese marittime come tematica della storia sociale ed economica e della storia dell'imprenditoria, e ciò in quanto consentono di comprendere i movimenti commerciali e le rotte dei viaggi, ma anche lo status politico ed economico degli imprenditori della navigazione, i presupposti per la concentrazione di capitali e i settori di investimento dei profitti, i metodi di organizzazione e gestione delle imprese marittime, le questioni riguardanti le tecniche di costruzione e funzionamento delle navi, la composizione dell'equipaggio, eccetera. Le informazioni attinte alle fonti di cui si è parlato potrebbero essere valorizzate nel modo più efficace soltanto inserendole in un'adeguata base dati. L'esperienza delle ricerche di archivio svolte fino ad ora ha già indicato i parametri e i settori che questa base dati dovrebbe avere, così come le principali questioni metodologiche. Una di tali questioni è il carattere complementare di tutte le relative fonti e la necessità di sancire la validità delle informazioni da queste fornite mediante altre fonti, dal momento che dai documenti notarili, nonostante la loro abbondanza, si deducono spesso dati che esigono poi conferme di vario tipo. Un'altra questione è quella della posizione privilegiata dal punto di vista archivistico delle isole Ionie in rapporto ad altre regioni greche. Il commercio marittimo che si muove da Venezia o viene stabilito con accordi stipulati nella città, in una certa misura può essere confermato o completato nei possedimenti, in particolare a Corfù, dove si è conservata buona parte dei documenti di archivio, prodotti già a partire dalla fine del XV secolo, e in misura minore a Cefalonia e a Cerigo. Su un piano più pratico, due osservazioni riguardano l'identificazione delle navi. La prima concerne la loro identificazione in base al capitano, proprietario o comproprietario, quando mancano informazioni sul nome dell'imbarcazione. La seconda osservazione riguarda la comproprietà. Se non si conosce la precisa distribuzione delle quote e i loro cambiamenti nel corso del tempo attraverso per esempio un registro di navi, non è possibile distinguere se una nave, che nella fonte non viene indicata con il suo nome, ma viene indicata con il nome del capitano, del proprietario o del comproprietario, è identificabile con un'altra, dal momento che la stessa persona può possedere quote di compartecipazione in entrambe le imbarcazioni. Per quanto riguarda l'identità di navi che appartengono a sudditi, confesso la mia difficoltà di rispondere chiaramente alla seguente serie di interrogativi. Queste navi sono annoverate nella flotta veneziana? Sono veneziane o non vengono considerate tali perché si tratta semplicemente di navi appartenenti ai sudditi? Ai numerosi studi che collocano quasi automaticamente la marina mercantile dei sudditi della Serenissima in una categoria quasi del tutto distinta, né nella flotta veneziana ma nemmeno autonoma, possiamo porre due esempi che rappresentano ottiche differenti, quella del governo veneziano e quella dello storico contemporaneo. Nel 1499, all'inizio del secondo conflitto turco-veneto, Sanudo fa riferimento a un censimento di imbarcazioni mercantili veneziane che in caso di necessità potevano trasformarsi in navi da guerra. In questo elenco viene registrato il totale delle navi sia nel porto di Venezia che nei possedimenti, comprese le piccole imbarcazioni dei sudditi. In tempi diversi, nel 1998, negli atti di un convegno organizzato proprio qua nell'Istituto Veneto, Ugo Tucci dichiarava di non accettare l'uso dell'espressione marina mercantile cretese per la fine del XVI secolo, dal momento che tali navi non operavano in maniera autonoma, in quanto erano veneziane, erano di proprietà, cioè di sudditi della Serenissima e battevano bandiera veneziana. Si potrebbe arricchire l'osservazione di Ugo Tucci, senza dubbio fondata, con altri interrogativi che costituiscono una stimolante sfida nel campo della ricerca, sfida che non sembra essere stata ancora lanciata fino ad oggi. Quando era veneziana la flotta mercantile veneziana nei vari periodi? Quale fu cioè l'effettiva presenza dei sudditi della Repubblica, greci o slavi, nella sua composizione? Come viene registrata quantitativamente nel corso del tempo? Una breve riflessione sotto forma di conclusioni. Nell'ultimo decennio, il ruolo dei greci nelle acque del Mediterraneo, agli inizi dell'età moderna, rappresenta una tematica che ha attirato l'interesse degli storici. Si sono adoperati vari modelli interpretativi e teorie basati su particolari concezioni riguardo alla utilità e finalità della ricerca di archivio per valorizzare vecchi e nuovi studi e mettere in luce fonti più o meno conosciute. Esprimo un punto di vista tradizionalista dicendo che gli schemi interpretativi sull'evoluzione dell'imprenditoria mercantile dei sudditi greci di Venezia, al di là dell'uso di modelli teorici, semplici o compositi, come pure di esperienze della storiografia internazionale, per poter funzionare hanno bisogno, diciamo così, di carburante. In altre parole, presuppongono una solida e attendibile documentazione, che nella storia della navigazione mercantile riguarda prima di tutto e soprattutto la nave. La nave come unità imprenditoriale costituita da molte persone, organizzate sulla base di rapporti a vari livelli, che usava le vie del mare per il commercio, i trasporti, il potere politico, eccetera. Rimangono dunque da individuare le navi imprese come singole tessere, per poi inserirle in una base dati attendibile. Si devono raccogliere tutte le caratteristiche riguardanti la loro organizzazione, le loro strategie di valorizzazione, gli individui che le gestivano nelle loro dimensioni sociali ed economiche e via dicendo. E sulla base di tutti questi elementi si potranno dedurre le necessarie valutazioni quantitative e qualitative, tutte procedure che necessariamente ci riconducono ancora una volta al materiale di archivio. Vi ringrazio.
Thank you very much, Professor Pankratis. And now we will get to the one and only art historical paper of this symposium. Professor Deborah Howard from the University of Cambridge is going to speak about archival evidence in the study of cross-cultural artistic connections This is, of course, an issue on which she is a specialist, as I'm sure many of you know her book on the Oriental elements that have entered Venetian art and architecture. Professor Howard, please.
I shall speak in English, but I will try to speak clearly, and I hope that even if you don't understand, you will enjoy the images. So this aims to examine the role of documents as an expression, sign, and instrument of economic, political, and cultural exchange. So today, I want to consider the value of documents in the study of architectural identity and material culture. How can archival evidence inform the study of cross-cultural exchange, cross-cultural exchange of visual information? Before the era of printing, this question is especially pertinent. In the later medieval and early modern periods, what kinds of visual documentation were transmitted, and how far did verbal records facilitate the dissemination of images? How can archival evidence throw light on the creation, intended meaning, use, and reception of buildings and artifacts? This paper reflects upon the research which underpinned my book, Venice in the East, published in the year 2000, and in a number of my subsequent essays, book chapters, and articles. Since the publication of my own book, a series of important studies has enlarged on the topic. In particular, I don't know where I need to, there we are, whoops. In particular, the exhibition, Venice and the Islamic World, curated by Stefano Carboni, which was shown in Paris, New York, and Venice. This is a little bit unpredictable, this thing. When I began to study this issue 25 years ago, I hoped to penetrate more deeply into the traditional identity and mentality of Venice as an international emporium, or in the words of Giuseppe Fiocco, a colossal souk. At the time, the standard history of Venice and its overseas connections still focused on times of tension, wars, crusades, commercial disputes, and piracy, because these were the frictions that dominated the narratives of official and diplomatic exchange. By contrast, the descriptions by pilgrims and travelers recorded a myriad of personal exchanges within the cosmopolitan communities of the Oltremare. So how could a study of different kinds of evidence illuminate these cultural interactions? 20th century accounts of Eastern influences in the arts were colored by the Eurocentric colonial perspective, famously highlighted by Edward Said in his classic study of Orientalism. To take one example, the Orientalist perspective surrounds the reaction to the demolition of the so-called Fondaco dei Persiani in 1908, exemplified by an elegiac article published in the Burlington magazine. It was, in sooth, a shut-in, gloomy spot, and yet the heavy air and dim light seemed in keeping with the Eastern associations which haunted it, while it required no play of fancy to clothe those walls with the carpets and hangings that Persian merchants brought in the olden time to Venice to see or to exchange for wares that were chiefly to be found in Western markets. Well, how could such a decrepit, mundane structure hold such exotic associations? And why would gloom and dim light be so redolent of the dazzling sunlit cities of Persia? Local tradition, retold by both Ennio Concina and Donatella Calabi, identifies this long-demolished structure as the Fondaco dei Persiani, although as far as I've been able to discover, none of the surviving documents relating to this structure in the 16th century ever mentions its use by Persians. Situated next to the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the building seems at first to have had a much less exotic function as the lodging house called Zu der Fleuten, also known as the Inn of St. George, where the German pilgrim Felix Faber or Fabri stayed on his way to the Holy Land in 1480. In this case, oral tradition seems to be poorly supported by archival evidence, but a fascinating hint of its possible later function emerges surprisingly when we come to consider some material evidence of contacts between Venice and Persia. It's important to stress that in the exploration of artistic exchange, documentation also includes material objects. Museum collections and treasuries are a kind of archive, and their inventories in themselves can provide precious documentation. In the treasury of the Procuratoria de San Marco is a fine early 17th century Persian silk carpet, probably made in a court workshop in Kashan. This was one of 5 rugs received by the Doge as a diplomatic gift in the time of Shah Abbas, when an attempt was made to reinstate close trading relations between Venice and Persia. To start the negotiations, the Shah sent a letter to the Venetians written on his behalf by an Englishman, Sir Anthony Shirley, who had been at the Persian court for several months. Here is a Western person painted in one of the buildings of Shah Abbas. I don't know if this is him, but it doesn't really matter because it suggests the context. Because the main focus was to revive trade in silk, the diplomatic exchanges in Venice involved elaborate gift-giving ceremonies in which precious textiles were exchanged. The gift-giving ceremony was publicly commemorated in the Doge's palace in a huge painting by Gabriele and Carletto Cagliari in 1603, in itself a kind of historical document. In reality, the Shah's envoy, Sir Anthony Shirley, was an unscrupulous English adventurer rather than a serious diplomat. Resident in Venice from 1601 to 4, he engaged in espionage for various different parties. And it's in the investigation of his life that we come upon a chance mention of the Fondaco dei Persiani, discussed earlier. For in late 1603, Shirley was arrested for, quote, an insult to the Persian merchant's house. So perhaps it did have that use after all. In the case of Venice, the Saidian imperialist perspective can only be properly applied to the Republic's true colonies in the Adriatic and Greece, about which we've been hearing. Venice's so-called colonies in the Near and Middle East were merely trading bases negotiated by treaty with the host country, as we heard yesterday. The important exception is the period of the Crusades, when Venetians moved east with their families to become expatriate feudal landowners in the Oltremare. Here the colonial perspective is well supported by surviving documentation. For example, Marsilio Zorzi's detailed inventory of Venetian property in Tyre and Acre, San Giovanni d'Acri, in 1243-4, included not only the communal buildings, such as the Fondaco, but also numerous private houses and country estates. This inventory shows that Venetians took over existing Muslim housing stock, not to mention a bathhouse known as the Bath of Saladin. Mosques were converted into churches, or even in one case, into a private house. In consequence, Acre acquired a deep significance in Venetian merchant culture, a significance reflected in the decision to admit to the Great Council the 9 most notable families who returned to Venice after the fall of Acre in 1291. The Leon family, who took up residence in the Campiello del Remer, seem to have intended a reminiscence of the Hospital of St. John in their eclectic collage of buildings around the courtyard. So this is the only period in which Venetians could be said to have established a strong sense of cultural and political domination, as intended by Said. By contrast, the merchants in the post-Crusader period traded by privilege rather than by colonizers, and this alters the nature of these interactions, making the East-West binary less useful. Well, cartography is a huge topic, and we had a paper about this on Thursday, so I'll be very brief, but it'll be obvious that maps are an important part of visual transmission. Maps help to locate the spatial experience of travel in the mind of the traveler. Atlases, however, were precious and bulky for use on board ship. In general, navigation skills relied on the stars and the compass, and until the 16th century, many port-lands used verbal instructions rather than maps to guide sailors into overseas ports. One of the most famous and important early cartographers was Pietro Visconti, whose illustrations in Marin Sanuto di Torsello's Liber Secretorum Fidelium Crucis included influential city views. We've just seen his map of Acre. His representation of Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem bore only scant resemblance to the actual building, which was then erroneously believed to be the biblical Palace of Solomon. You can see that it says Domus Salomonis there. All the same, Pietro Visconti's schematic sketch seems to have been one of the images that informed the rebuilding of the Palazzo Ducale in the mid-14th century. In the exploration of architectural influences, we need to remember that very few building craftsmen traveled to the Eastern Mediterranean, except in the period of the Crusades. A rare example is the Venetian mosaicist called Zanne, who signed his name in the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. And the close resemblance between the mosaics of the doubting Thomas in Bethlehem and San Marco seems to support the connection. So given the similarity between these two scenes, some kind of sketch seems to have been transported across the seas. Illustrated books before the age of printing were valuable objects in their own right, and this obviously accounts for their survival. We know that mosaics in the north atrium of San Marco were based on the famous cotton Genesis, probably made in Egypt in the 5th or 6th century. This book, also known as the Cotton Bible, would have survived better had it not been badly burned in a fire in England in 1731, long afterwards. We can surmise that other illustrated books imported from the Eastern Mediterranean in the early 13th century, such as copies of the Mahamat of Al-Hariri, may have been known in the workshop of the Basilica. I've already mentioned the seemingly constant state of friction between the Republic of Venice and her Muslim trading partners as described in official public records. But in the case of diplomatic correspondence, this tension in itself could enhance direct cultural transmission. Envoys were instructed in how to write a relazione on the conclusion of an embassy, reporting on the history, geography, and culture of the foreign power, and underlining the essential interrelationship between politics and cultural knowledge. Dispatches sent frequently during a diplomatic mission also contain a wealth of cultural information, often added to sensitive information written in cipher. So you can see that this document is in cipher down to here, and then this is less sensitive and continues in normal script. For example, in a dispatch of urgent military significance, written in cipher in January 1569, the Venetian bailo in Constantinople, Marcantonio Barbaro, went on to add an enthusiastic description of the Ottoman Grand Vizier's latest mosque. In this secret message, which was about the release of Venetian prisoners, Barbaro related that His Excellency, Sokollu Mehmet Pasha, is making various absolutely superb buildings, that is, a mosque, a bath complex, and a caravanserai with the most beautiful marbles, huge columns, and other rich stones. So, precisely because of the importance of sensitive intelligence information, diplomatic communications could also provide a direct conduit of artistic information right into the heart of government. Communications requesting diplomatic gifts also offered a channel for the exchange of visual information. As we know from Barbaro's now well-known dispatch, including drawings for 900 mosque lamps in reticello glass to be made in Murano for the Grand Vizier. In 1569, Barbaro wrote, "The magnificent first Pasha, with great insistence, has asked me to order 900 lamps for a mosque he is building. That is 300 of the larger size, as shown, 300 of the long shape, and another 300 half as big again as the long ones." And then he goes on, "As for the proportions, I leave that to the Venetian craftsmen who know the usual type." End quote. So this assumption that the Murano glassmakers already knew how to make mosque lamps testifies to the established matrix of East-West exchange already in place. Well, in sharp contrast to the very fraught business of diplomacy, Portolan's merchant handbooks, private correspondence, travel diaries, and pilgrim chronicles paint a very different picture. Some of these were intensely personal accounts intended solely for family members or business partners, while others were copied and recopied to be passed down through the generations. Some texts were illustrated with drawings, maps, or prints. The fact that so much of this private material has survived indicates that its content seemed worthy of preservation. The physical crisscrossing of the Mediterranean by merchant handbooks and tariff books, and of course we're celebrating the publication of an important tariff book today, provides a precious testimony to the passage of information back and forth. Portolan's and merchant handbooks were actively annotated and updated. Such additions, inscriptions, alterations, and marginalia give an immediacy and proximity to the mercantile world and the changing priorities of its protagonists. And I'll just mention a few examples that I found very useful in my research. So the careful preservation of such mercantile information across the generation accounts for the survival of the much-traveled 13th century handbook, the Tarife di Pesi e Misure in Alessandria, Portolato per Alessandria in the Marciana. Now, I found incredibly moving being able to hold this book in my hand, a book of that date that had been back and forth between Venice and Alexandria several times, It's just an experience that I think I could. It's very hard to explain the emotional effect of such a privilege, let's say. Handbook, Venetian handbook, preserved again in England, in Greenwich, compiled between 1470 and 1529, contains a miscellany of useful information on matters such as navigation and shipbuilding, and again prayers and medical remedies. And as many as 4 later hands annotated the manuscript Tarifa de Pesi e Spese of 1493, now also in the Marciana. These manuals rarely offer material directly relevant to the visual arts, but they reveal the cultural and economic context of commercial interaction and the types of goods bought and sold, including pigments, textiles, and gems. So it's a window into material culture. They are also objects whose biographies reveal interesting historical perspectives in their own right. The handbook in Greenwich, number 3 on that list, even includes a recipe for mixing colours for use in cartography, obtained from none other than the artist Gentile Bellini. Venice, of course, doesn't have extensive private trading archives on the scale of, for instance, the Datini archives in Prato. But several collections of surviving merchants' letters have been studied by economic historians, as everybody here will know. The classic work is Frederick Lane's study of Andrea Barbarigo. But this correspondence reveals little of direct relevance to the visual arts. And Barbarigo himself certainly had no interest, sadly, in investing his wealth in building. Most merchant letters are factual accounts of trading concerns with occasional expressions of mood, such as the letters of the melancholic Andrea Berengo in the Cinquecento. An intriguing survival is the letter of advice written by Benedetto Sanudo, himself later an important diplomat in Egypt, to his brother Andrea, who was about to set sail for Alexandria for the first time. This letter is preserved in a contemporary copy in the Cicogno manuscripts in the Museo Correr. This letter advises the inexperienced traveller. I think that, as far as I've been able to discover, Andrea was actually older than Benedetto, but it was all the same his first voyage. It advises the inexperienced traveller how to conduct himself during the voyage and later in Alexandria. He was not to gamble on board ship, but to spend his time reading and writing. And if he had to play backgammon, he should only do so with the priest. Most of the advice is concerned with the security of the cargo. Andrea had to be careful not to allow his textiles to be blown into the harbour when opening his chest in Alexandria. But we don't learn anything about the type of cloth. But anyway, although lacking specific visual details, such documentation establishes the mentality and the cultural and economic concerns of the two brothers. And of course, it leaves unanswerable the question of how far such advice was heeded by the recipient. Travel narratives provide a wealth of personal response to the culture of the Oltremare. The epic journeys of Marco Polo, Josefat Barbaro, and Ambrogio Contarini were all included in Ramusio's compendium of travel literature in the mid-Cinquecento, and are therefore very well known, have been very well known ever since. To these may be added a valuable corpus of lesser-known travel writings preserved in manuscript form, many of which were listed by Donazzolo in 1926. In my own research, I found the following especially valuable. So, an anonymous journey from Aleppo to Tabriz in 1498, which is in the Cigogna papers in the Corriere. Giovanni Barnese's description of the same Benedetto Sanudo's embassy to Cairo in 1502, which is in the Marciana, and the account by Bourbon Morosini of his expedition from Damascus to Jerusalem in 1514, which is also in the Marciana. These writers adopted an ekphrastic strategy, which I called in my book the mirror of the familiar, to convey architectural features to their readers by analogy with known Venetian buildings. Morosini, for example, recounts that he was able to enter Al-Aqsa Mosque disguised as a Muslim with the help of his friend, the Qadi, the Muslim judge. And then he goes on to describe the interior in terms of this mosque using the vocabulary of Venetian church building. The anonymous traveler to Tabriz, the first one of these, boasted that he was skillful in numerous languages and that he had long familiarity with the Eastern lands to authenticate the truth of his account. A rare example of a travel narrative with illustrations, again mentioned by Benjamin Arbel yesterday, is the wonderful volume now in the Folger Library in Washington, written by the Venetian merchant Alessandro Magno, son of the famous humanist Stefano Magno. Following his voyages to Cyprus, Egypt, Spain, England, Flanders, and Germany between 1557 and 1565, Magno copied out his travels in a vellum-bound volume in a fluid italic hand, illustrated by his own sketches, adding, I quote, "There being nothing more enjoyable for those seeking the world than memories of past events, I've decided, for this reason, and as a relaxation, per otio," he says, to write up details of my journey. Pilgrim narratives tend to be a bit less informative in the context of cultural exchange because every traveler seeks to match whatever he or she sees with mental pictures already planted in the imagination by reading the Bible. Nevertheless, they often contain richly detailed topographical information, and they highlight the delicate nature of discussions of matters of faith with non-Christians. Like tariff books, handbooks of the indulgences to be earned in each of the holy places were passed down as precious heirlooms. An example is this little, it's very small little book, vellum-bound 15th century example in the Marciana, where the plenary indulgences, where you had total release from purgatory, are marked with red crosses. I'm sorry that this is in black and white, but these crosses here, beside the Golden Gate and the Church of St. Anna and so on, those are places you get a plenary indulgence. They're marked with red. Splashed by water, and one doesn't know if it's tears or holy water or the waves of the sea, this much-traveled book preserves the aura of a religious relic in its own right. And of course, it's obvious to everybody that oral narratives supplemented the textual information outlined here. in the family, and in the marketplace, although this discourse remains in the realms of our historical imagination. I mean, this charming little fresco in the Scuola dei Caligari at San Tomás is the sort of thing that would have aroused discussion among the shoemakers of the Scuola as they gathered in their meeting place. The mass of documentation buried in the notarial archives opens a window into the private lives of Venetians who spent time in the Oltremare, and many other speakers talked about these wonderful notarial resources. I'm going to mention as a particularly rich example, from the point of view of material culture, the inventories of the property of 4 Venetians who died in Damascus in the period 1455 to 1457. And I've published these inventories in the Studi Veneziani in 1993 with Francesco Bianchi, together with the surviving wills. So these 4 individuals were 2 very wealthy merchants, Stefano Ravagnino and Stefano di Bossina, the Venetian consul, Marino da Molin, and a 4th person, Niccolò de Ruzzino, who unfortunately died on board ship before reaching Damascus. But it's charming to see that he had, just as we do today, cabin baggage and baggage in the hold. So he had what he wanted to read on the voyage and everything else separated. On their deaths, the belongings of the 4 Venetians were inventoried by the chaplain, the priest notary to the Venetian community, Cristoforo del Fiore. This is not him, but it's an image to remind you of that sort of person. Cristoforo del Fiore was already familiar with East-West mercantile activity, having earlier served as the chaplain and notary to the Venetian community in Alexandria. Now, it's very important to remember the purpose of the inventories. These are not probate valuations. They're simply the descriptions of the possessions of the deceased before they were packed up and dispatched back to Venice. In the case of merchandise, such as textiles and coinage, quantities are given. And otherwise, the sizes of objects are indicated only by loose terms such as large or small. The condition of objects that are already old or damaged is clearly specified as expressions such as torn or shabby or even triste. And the items are sorted only according to where they were found, as if the notary just went round the room, just noting all the things he saw. In the contents of any one room or chest, objects seem to be listed in a random order, with household objects mixed up with merchandise. Reading the documents conveys a vivid impression of the cosmopolitan lifestyle and surroundings of the owners, even if none of the exact objects described can be identified in any museum today. The profusion of miscellaneous articles adds to the intimacy of the documents, ranging from the exotic, like a medium-sized piece of dragon's blood, which of course is a resin used as a pigment, to the prosaic old dirty shirt, torn handkerchief with blue embroidery. The notary, Cristoforo del Fiore, was clearly familiar with Islamic material culture. Numerous objects are described as moresco, or arabesco, or alla damaschina, although he doesn't seem to have differentiated clearly between moresco and arabesco and so on. These were sort of generic terms. Since very few Mamluk carpets survive today, the inventories offer especially valuable information about the ownership of carpets. For example, the consul, Marino da Molin, had no fewer than 6 carpets of different sizes in his large private chamber. True porcelain is carefully distinguished, that is to say Chinese porcelain, from local Syrian blue and white fritware. Occasional items are characterized as Western, that is, a la Franca, or as German. One of the people had a German roasting spit with counterweights brought all the way from Germany to Damascus. I think this is fascinating. Little is specified as Venetian, apart from some of the coinage and one consignment of glass beads from Venice. And otherwise, we can only guess at the origin of the object. Merchants shared their knowledge and experiences in the marketplace or on overland journeys, and in general, they were much more open-minded and observant than pilgrims. The 2 merchants in the Damascus, in these Damascus inventories, owned a lot of local clothing, including numerous mutande moresque, and we have one surviving pair from this period of Mamluk underpants in Brussels, skull caps, belts, and handkerchiefs. Whereas the consul had a lot of formal robes, Venetian robes with different kinds of fur and different kinds of colors and so on. The significance of these inventories is that the kaleidoscopic profusion of material goods from both East and West was to be parceled up and sent back into the homes of the heirs, right into the heart of Venetian family life. Well, to conclude, these records suggest that the interaction between Italian travelers and Muslims in the Eastern Mediterranean world was both more frequent and more friendly than official documents suggest. This range of different kinds of documentation, all of these things are very well known to people in this room, but I'm the only person who's speaking about how useful they might be for artistic transfer, help to create a broader context for the exchange of knowledge as well as merchandise, and to highlight how the responses of Venetians to those they encountered overseas were not those of a dominant colonizing power in the Saidian sense. I've tried to propose a new model of cultural exchange, drawing on a wide variety of written material and architectural evidence to reconstruct the meanings and influence of these encounters. As in their commerce, Venetians made effective use of personal contacts to acquire knowledge, and the communications between individuals in the Oltremare informed cultural perspectives back home in Venice, in the family, in the street, in the marketplace, and in the heart of government. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting presentation and the beautiful images. And now the time has come for the discussion. I think I'll stand there. Yes, Francisco, please.
I'm Francisco Pellanes for Deborah Howard. It's just a couple of curiosities. It's not a very relevant question, but I've been working with these testaments drawn in Damascus by Cristoforo del Fiore recently in an article about the Funduks of Damascus, and I found first that the notary knew Arabic because he writes the name of Arabic houses in a way that denounces that he had literary knowledge of Arabic. He writes that in a perfect transcription and in a way that you never would write it without a knowledge of written Arabic. And this is, I don't know, we know few things about the personal cultural background of notaries, and I found this very exciting. The idea that these clerks that went again and again to the Middle East, they really had a cultural background. And second, I think that among the inventories of these deceased merchants, there is one who was carrying a tarifa when he died. Have you come across that? Thank you very much.
Yes. Well, first of all, about these inventories and Cristoforo del Fiore. I mean, the first thing I did when I started looking at them was to try to translate them all into English, just as a sort of matter of interest, really. And I found I had to use Hebrew dictionaries, Arabic dictionaries, Greek. I mean, it's the language is extremely eclectic, and there are words that you can't understand if you don't know the Arabic. I mean, they aren't Phoenician words, a lot of the words at all. I mean, you know, you're just citing one example, but a lot of the clothing, for example, was using Arabic terminology that wasn't used all that much in Europe. And I was just talking about this the other night at dinner. There was one word, mahalef, M-A-A-L-E-F. I couldn't find this in any dictionary, and eventually, talking to an Israeli colleague who works on medieval medicine, he told me it's a kind of cherry used for making medicines for stomach problems. And I mean, I would never have known this, but having discovered this, I keep finding mahalef in inventories. So I think other people, you know, did know it. But I think this is what I find very fascinating, because the whole cultural mentality of these people, including the notary, is it very receptive to Arabic culture and to, you know, and to local sort of very you know, it's the mentality of the merchant, acquisitive, getting things from everywhere and mixing them. And you know, the houses, I think, I mean, as you will have seen if you're reading these inventories, you know, there's an incredible sense of profusion of things from many, many different places. So I mean, I think the language itself is really worth writing about, studying by somebody, because I found it really, really fascinating. So, I mean, I think your point is absolutely correct.
Yes. Thank you very much. Yeah, Georg.
I guess ho tante domande, ma soltanto magari una per Gerasimos e poi qualche osservazione per Deborah. Forse forse l'hai detto, io non l'ho capito, solo per chiarificazione. Questi greci, diciamo, soddetti ottomani, veri e propri, nel senso non veneziani, o sì, non erano soddetti perché erano soddetti veneziani, e i veneziani in un certo modo formalmente erano anche soddetti ottomani. A Venezia, cioè tu dici non trovi tracce nella documentazione della scuola dei greci, ma nella documentazione privata trovi tracce dell'interazione fra greci cosiddetti veneziani e greci non veneziani. Ma dici che anche erano integrati in un certo modo, anche nella scuola, solo che non si poteva dimostrare nei documenti, o dici che l'interazione era puramente commerciale? E per Deborah, I would have lots of things obviously to say, so maybe we do that bilaterally, but...
So should we take one question
well,
at a
yeah,
time?
Quello che ho detto che anzi, volevo dire è che a Venezia arrivano tante navi dal Levante, navi con equipaggi ottomani, navi con equipaggi veneziani. Ci sono in queste navi greci, sia sudditi veneziani che ottomani. La parte che fa parte, la parte di questi marinai e di questi proprietari di navi che si rappresenta anche tramite la confraternita greca, Confraternita di San Nicolò, è una piccola percentuale. Vorrei dire cioè che guardare e studiare il commercio greco, quello che portano i greci a Venezia tramite gli archivi della confraternita greca, ti dà solo una piccola parte di quello che era il commercio ellenico nelle fonti, nel porto di Venezia. E ciò per vari motivi. Uno di questi motivi è il numerus clausus che aveva la comunità greca di 250 persone ogni anno. Non che questo vuol dire che tutte queste persone abitavano a Venezia. È quello che volevo dire solo.
I will try to limit myself just to 1-2 points. I totally agree, obviously, with what you're saying, and thank you very much for all these nice examples, which give me lots of things to look up with great pleasure. Yet, although agreeing that on a personal level, these are very important contacts, I find in the documentation I know particularly well, but the only one I know sufficiently well to say something about it, Piazza Dolfino and Lorenzo Dolfino, so these commissarie, which I would say are almost as important as the Latini, just nobody knows, but so it's, I guess, something to promote further, that the spits sent to the Orient, it seems to me to be rather the more dominant element. I find it surprising how much the Venetians in Alexandria remain in a little Venetian cultural bubble and are actually not interacting this much. Of course, they invite jugglers to the Fondaco and they invite the emir to the Fondaco. And there's a certain amount of exchange, but what I found in documents relating to deceased Venetians in Alexandria is actually that basically a Venetian inventory. And what they're sending back to Venice are a few orientalizing things. Carpets are very important, and they specify why these carpets are important to basically, yes, as conspicuous, I guess, consumption or luxury goods to show in the sandali or well, whatever, in the boats, so for public display. But otherwise, the amount of things shipped to Alexandria for just covering for the daily, for sort of the needs of daily life, I found astonishing. Meat, cheese, wine, like lots of things that you would find, what you would think they would find that in Alexandria, and of a better quality perhaps. But those are devotional objects. Ancona di carta, and I asked lots of art historians, and they were like, can't really say much about it. So you would think, well, when a merchant is in Alexandria, it's fantastic. You can buy a nice Coptic icon. That's much more precious, much more interesting, and you can sell it at a high value maybe in Venice. But no, they brought the paper devotional image from, I don't know, from where, I guess from Venice, to Alexandria.
Well, I agree with you, and I think I mean, I didn't say this in my paper, a very compressed summary of a lot of work I've done over a long period. So, of course, it's very generalized, but I think Alexandria is very, very different from Damascus, because in Damascus, the Venetians were allowed to live in the city any place. They didn't have to live in the Fondaco. Most of them didn't live in the Fondaco, apart from the consul. And, you know, in Alexandria, they're much more confined to the two Fondaci, and they get bothered a lot. You know, there are examples of times when, for example, you know, the authorities, the customs authorities, only insist on delivering the meat during Lent and things like that. You know, they're sort of hassled a little bit, and I think they live much more isolated from, I mean, I think the letter, the Benedetto Sanudo letter is fascinating in that way, that, you know, he's got to be very careful when he's walking around in Alexandria, because, you know, people are dangerous. I don't think that's the case in Damascus. I think a lot of these Phoenicians lived for, you know, this period for quite lengthy times in Damascus. I mean, one of the merchants was living in the house of a Venetian nobleman who owned a house in Damascus. So they're much more integrated. They're wearing local clothes. We know this from Bertrand de la Borquière, and we also know this from the treaties, you know, from the Patti, that they're allowed to dress in local dress. And the Venetians are I think, much more integrated probably than many other Western merchants. But I think in Alexandria, all the Franchi are really kept themselves more than in Damascus. That's certainly my impression. I mean, there are other people here who know much more about this, I'm sure. But I think I think the distinction you're making is important.
Thank you very much. Are there other questions? Yes, Benjamin Arbel, please.
Thank you. I have a question for Professor Karpov and Professor Ganchou and Professor Pagrati. So I'll probably do it one by one. Sergei, yeah, one very brief observation concerning the sums left for the notaries that you. It struck me compared to the sums that appear in many testaments from Crete that I have read recently, as a very high remuneration, 5 times as much. If 5 ducats is a standard sum, so this may explain what attracted the Venetian notaries to go as far as Tana and get a nice remuneration for their work. I mean, this is a nice. This is just a footnote, but my question concerns probably a difficult a question. A bit difficult to answer, but I would like to hear your opinion, probably as a hypothesis. You mentioned this brief crisis in the slave trade following the Black Death, and well, it's comprehensible, of course, but then a quick ripresa. Since you talked in Italian, I should probably also.
No problem, you can talk any.
Una ripresa molto veloce e mi chiedo sulle repercussioni di questi cambiamenti sul retto Ortera, cioè su quelle società nei quali si cercava questi schiavi, si comprava questi schiavi, cioè forse non ci sono forse documentazioni, ma si può forse fare qualche ipotesi sull'impatto sì, di questa domanda piuttosto alta, l'intervento del mercato degli schiavi, cioè l'impatto su queste società delle steppe, non so da dove provenivano questi schiavi. Forse mi fermo qua e andiamo avanti più.
So there are many interesting questions, and I will begin with the notaries and how they were let's say, rewarded for their work. It's very interesting. Of course, they had a salary from the consulate that existed in Tana. They had a salary. They were priests. And high salaries can be explained because they were priests. So they participated in funerals. They participated in ceremonies. And they were fathers for those merchants who worked there, probably. So that's why they had personal connections. And they have rather big sums because they were not only scribers, but they were also people who could preserve those documentation, who could conserve them, and then give them to, let's say, other people who were executors. It's not necessary that executor was in situ, in Tana. Sometimes this executor could be in different places, in Venice, in Constantinople, and other places. That's why for a notary was a very important person. That's why he was rewarded rather highly. So I can explain it this way. The second thing is slave trade. I wrote different articles on slave trade, and I have a, let's say, big paper in the conference of Prato when I talked about slave trade and diversities that were there. But I must say that there are very interesting documents that explain why people, let's say, even parents, were selling their sons and daughters to Italian merchants. There are a very interesting explanation in one of the documents. It is said verbally, because I want to save my son from hunger, from disease, from war, from the situation that existed. Because we can understand the slave trade in that time was absolutely different from slave trade in antiquity. Because people who became slaves, they were, let's say, domestics, as they say, not badly exploited as they were in antiquity. And after 20 years, after 12 years, they were free. And not only free, mostly Venetian merchants gave some sums for their marriages. They gave some sums for them to live as Roman citizens. They became Roman citizens. That's one that I say, that when we are speaking about Venetian population, we must remember what Pisanello depicted. There were so many Venetian citizens that went from the Black Sea, and that were not, let's say, Roman Catholics at first, and they were absolutely different from ethnic point of view. So there was a beginning of migration, and this migration was rather big, I must say. I studied ethnic composition of slave trade. It is also interesting that till, let's say, the 60s of the 14th century, the majority of slaves that were imported from the Black Sea were Tatars, 60% at least, sometimes even more, even 80. But after the Black Death, majority of slaves were of Caucasian origin, of Slavonic origins, also slaves from Russian steppes, from other places. So it was different, let's say, change in ethnicity of slaves that were brought to Venice, to other places. It's a very big and interesting question. I studied it in many particular articles. But what was interesting, why slave trade augmented? Because in Tana it was less controlled than in Kaffa, for instance, and in different places. So in Kaffa existed Officium Sancti Antonii, and this Officium Sancti Antonii controlled the slaves, and the slave could be sold only to a Christian. But Muslim merchants were very active. They wanted to take slaves, to bring them to Egypt, to other places. That's why they were selling those slaves in places less controlled. And Tana was one of those places. And Tana was a great, let's say, place where they could get slaves rather for good price. And the difference of prices. In Tana, an ordinary slave could be bought after the crisis, for instance, at 40 or 50 ducats. In Venice, he could be sold at 100, 120, and even 200 ducats. So it was great difference of taste. What was the great problem? Great problem was transportation, because slaves were dying during transportations on aboard ships because they wanted to, let's say, put as many slaves as possible. And that was the problem. And of course, the slaves that came to Italy did not live very badly. Of course, there were such examples when a slave could poison his master because his master misbehaved. But it's an exclusion, and he was badly punished in this way. And mostly, I must say that in most examples, they were well-to-do. It was not a high exploitation as it was in antiquity at all.
Here we have a question from Professor Jacobi. Thank you very much.
Well, for you, Deborah. There's, I think, one more way of by which the influence from the East was transferred to Venice, and that's by imitations. I'm referring especially to silk textiles. The silk industry in Venice began to develop in the early 13th century. When we have guild regulation of the 1260s, several of these silk types bear Greek names and are clearly influenced by Byzantine weaving. But from the 1260s, we have also the beginning of an import of textiles which were woven in Mongol-ruled territories. And they are imported. The first evidence I have found is from Acre. And part of these silks arrived in Venice. They also were sold probably in Zara to Hungarian and were used in the Hungarian court. And about 1300, we begin to see in the documentation silks which bear the same names as silks woven in Mongol-ruled territories, but they are called Venetian so-and-so. In other words, in Venice, they begin to imitate Mongol silk textiles woven in Mongol-ruled territories. And these textiles afterwards are distributed all over the West. So I think that's one more avenue by which one can. I have also, there's also, I think, almost surely an evidence of a specific silks which are still extant and which have been shown at an exhibition a few years ago in Verona. These textiles were buried into the grave of San Can Grande della Scala, and I think I have traced the way, first of all, that they were woven around 1320 in Tabriz and arrived probably through Damascus to Venice and from there to Verona.
Well, I mean, I completely agree that this is very, very important, and it's something I've actually worked on. I didn't really have time to discuss it. I mean, I've not worked on these particular early textiles, but I think especially from the sort of 15th century onwards, when the Mamluk manufactures were less successful, let's say, the Venetians are imitating all kinds of manufactures, textiles and metalwork, and it's influencing glass and all sorts of things. And I mean, the subject of Veneto Islamic metalwork is a very rich field, much studied by art historians, and I think that Stefano Carboni's exhibitions to some extent explored these connections, and Rosamund Mack has written about carpets, imitation of carpets and things like that. So I completely agree with you that imitation is a very important means of transmission of culture, and if I didn't mention it, I'm sorry, but I was very, I had a very big topic, but no, I absolutely. Thank you for your communication.
If I may just add that textiles which were imitations of Mongol ruled textiles, these same imitations made in the West were exported to the East and were imitated because the designs were partly changed. And in Mongol territories in the 14th century, they started to imitate the imitation made in the West.
Yeah, well, I suppose this is what literary historians, literary critics call intertextuality. I mean, I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I think with the example of the mosque lamps being sent to Istanbul is a classic example of that. The Venetians learn how to make mosque lamps, then they send them back to Istanbul. Anyway, I mean, thank you. It's a very important point, and I agree with it completely.
Yes, I think we can have one more question, and then I think Professor Ortaldo will want to close the session. Yes. Who has?
To ask very briefly, Thierry Ganchou, hai citato, hai fatto riferimento a questi testamenti che impongono questa eredità in linea maschile, generazione dopo generazione. Non ci sono clausole che prendono in considerazione la possibilità che non ci siano eredi maschi in questi testamenti?
Allora, il problema è che tutta questa parte di documentazione non è originale. Diciamo che tutto questo si trova dentro i procuratori di San Marco e sono delle copie del Settecento. Quindi c'è soltanto l'estratto che ho citato, per esempio, e anche il testamento di Francesco Bernardo del 1423, che è stato rogato da Andrea Locristiano, l'ho cercato, non l'ho mai trovato. Quindi ho soltanto questi estratti e in effetti non ho visto che era previsto il caso della mancanza di una discendenza maschile. Questo è strano, sì.
Thank you very much. And now, we will close the discussion. And now Professor Ortaldo is going to speak.
Sì, ma poche parole con qualche scrupolo per aver fermato una discussione che forse poteva ancora proseguire, ma in ogni caso quello che devo davvero fare è soltanto ringraziare chi ha partecipato a questi lavori, chi ha offerto le sue competenze, chi ha avuto la pazienza e il piacere di seguire questi lavori. Credo che dobbiamo essere soddisfatti, almeno questa è la mia impressione. Soddisfatti per un incontro che mi pare andato in modo positivo. La scommessa era quella di combinare un incontro tra analisi di tipologie di fonti e eventi e fatti. Ha funzionato. Questo era un primo incontro. Un ulteriore incontro era quello tra studiosi di alta e solida reputazione e studiosi di ottima reputazione, ma decisamente più giovani. Anche questo incontro mi pare abbia ben funzionato. Spero che l'Istituto Veneto di Scienze, Lettere ed Arti sia stato all'altezza dell'ospitalità dovuta a un lavoro così proficuo. Mi permetto di anticipare, si era detto fin dall'inizio tra di noi, alla fine dei lavori valuteremo se volere pubblicare gli atti o rinunciarci. Io credo già di poter dire che sicuramente l'Istituto Veneto sarà molto lieto di poter pubblicare gli atti che raccolgano i lavori qui svolti, e credo anche che lo faremo molto presto perché la struttura è una struttura che è in grado di lavorare rapidamente. Se ci fossero ancora problemi o necessità, vedo Sebastiano Pedrocco, che ringrazio per la sua costante presenza e attenzione, e se permettete un ringraziamento lo do anche al personale dell'Istituto Veneto, che ha cercato di rendervi più semplice possibile la permanenza in una città non semplice come è Venezia. Quindi, contando in qualche futura occasione per rivederci qui tutti quanti, vi ringrazio di nuovo e siamo liberi. Grazie.
Comunque, signore e signori, posso a nome di tutti i partecipanti ringraziare l'Istituto prima di tutto e personalmente il professor Ortali per questa generosa accoglienza che è stata offerta a noi tutti, e augurare tante belle cose all'Istituto e speriamo alla prossima.